What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, I'd like to go over a bunch of DOM manipulation methods that we're going to see all over the place when we're working with the DOM in JavaScript. Specifically in this video, I'd like to go over innerHTML as well as text content. I want to go over some of the dangers of innerHTML since this is such a common method I see used all over the place, and it can get a bit like you get kind of used to using it, but there's a lot of issues with this method, and I want to kind of push us away from that and actually start using other methods such as text content and more advanced methods that we're going to see in future videos, and I'm going to explain why in this video as well. There are other methods I'd like to go through such as inner text and the newer set HTML as well. So let's just get right into these methods together and see how we can actually start manipulating the DOM for the first time. Okay, so to start, as I mentioned, this is kind of an overview of what we're going to go through in this video. The most common DOM manipulation methods that we're going to be seeing, and when I say DOM manipulation, I generally mean things like creating elements, adding elements to the DOM, updating elements that are already in the DOM, all through these different methods. So up until now, what we've really been seeing is how we can kind of select elements out of the DOM and then kind of grab properties off of them and see kind of how that works, grab their text content and all that kind of stuff. In this video, we're going to finally be able to actually manipulate that and reach back into the DOM and actually change some of these things that we see in there, which is going to be pretty cool. So to start, innerHTML. Now this is kind of the one that we're going to see all over the place. Okay, when you first learn the DOM, this is fantastic to learn how to actually manipulate elements in the DOM and add our own elements. It turns out though that this is something that we don't want to really rely on too much because there's a lot of issues with this, as I'm going to explain in a second. There's text content, which I'm actually going to encourage us to use the most because it doesn't really suffer from the same issues as innerHTML, even though it's less powerful on purpose, so it doesn't cause as much danger in the worst case. And generally, I'll kind of point out how in later videos we're actually going to fix some of these shortcomings and actually be able to kind of bring that power safely into our DOM. Now, there are some other methods such as inner text. I'm not really going to go over this too much, but as we see with text content, inner text is kind of a version of that deals with styling and some other things as well. Not as used because it's also a little bit slower, so I'm not really going to touch on this too much. Just be aware that it is there, and it's very similar to text content with some minor differences. There's a newer method as well that's been added to the DOM API. This is set HTML. This is actually so new that in fact some browsers don't even support it. I think ironically actually Firefox doesn't actually support this, as well as many other browsers. For example, Internet Explorer from back in the day definitely doesn't support this. This is quite new. We're not going to go over this. I'm just going to kind of mention it as a safer alternative to innerHTML if we have access to it. But generally, we really want to be sticking with these because we want to be able to support as many browsers as possible until this really becomes quite a standard. Okay, so let's kind of start. innerHTML, this is kind of the big one. This is one we're going to see used everywhere, and I'm going to kind of mention the shortcomings in this slide actually. So let's assume that we have this HTML right here. Okay, on the left-hand side of my screen, it's a body, and it has a nav tag inside of it. And inside the nav tag, there is a unordered list that has 3 list items in it. Okay, it's got a home, a blog, and a videos. This is pretty similar to how you might see an actual nav bar built, for example. Pretty accessibility friendly if we were to add some of the area tags in here. And it's kind of easy to tab through for screen readers. So this is a perfectly normal navbar UL with a bunch of list items in there. If we were to do document.body, we would be grabbing this green DOM node right here, this DOM element. Okay, the body HTML element. If we did innerHTML to access the innerHTML property on the body object, we would actually get this blue section right here, which I actually have highlighted here. So we're actually going to grab all of the HTML contained inside of the element that we're grabbing this property off of. So if we were to do this, for example, on the UL, we would actually be getting all the list items inside of it. Okay, if we were to do this on the nav, we would be getting the UL and all the list items inside of it. It's all of the HTML that's nested inside of that elements that we're asking for the innerHTML of, including all the child elements. All right. So you can see in this case that we get the navbar with the UL, all the list items perfectly in there. Now, what's nice about this is that we can actually not only read this property out of the DOM and see what's in there, we can actually write back into it and actually manipulate it and change it to see how that updates the DOM and changes the inner HTML. So this is already one of the kind of issues with this method. So I'm just gonna, before I go into some of the other cons here, and I have a whole slide on this as well, I just wanna actually just code this because actually seeing it is just so much more instructive than me just yapping about it, as much as I love yapping about it. So I'm gonna pull up VS Code. I'm gonna make a new file here. I'm just gonna say innerHTML .html. This is not HTML.html like my first video, so please don't harp on me too much for this. I'm gonna add a doc type in here, HTML. I'm gonna add my HTML tag. I'm gonna add my head tag. I'll just give it a title of, that's not title, I think it's just title, just like that, of inner HTML demo. And I'll add my body tag. And in my body, I'm going to keep it very similar to what I have over there. I'm going to have a nav, a UL, and I'm going to have an LI. In this LI, I'm going to have a home, and I'm going to have a few of these. I'm going to have, what was it? I had my blog, and then, not my glog, my blog, and then my videos. Okay, so that's my HTML. If I save it, Prettier is going to kick in and insert all the text nodes that formats this nicely for me. If I right click this, reveal in Finder, and then I double click to open this, it should actually open it in my Google Chrome. So we can see in here that I have a nice kind of list of my LIs, right? So if I inspect this and I open up my developer tools and I zoom in a whole bunch so that we can see this a bit more clearly, what we can see is that we have the kind of head is in there, the body, the nav, the UL, and then we have all these different LIs. Okay, the markers are being are these little dots as well that are kind of these pseudo elements. Okay, so now what's interesting is if I was to actually try to change this, let's see what happens. So I'm going to switch to my console. I'm going to do document.body, and I'm going to grab that. So you can see that when I do document.body, I get access to the body element. When in this case, it has the nav element inside of it, as well as all the UL and all the different LI tags. Okay. Now, if I do body document, oh my gosh, can't spell it today. Document.body.innerHTML. Okay. Now, be careful with this. We want the HTML to be all in uppercase. Okay. So if I do this, what you'll notice is the new lines are actually in there from the text nodes, but what we also have in here is the actual HTML tags. We have our nav bar, we have our UL, we have our LI with the content inside of it, all the 3 LIs, the closing tags, and then finally the closing tags. Okay, now this is pretty awesome. I want to see something interesting. If I switch back here and I actually add an, let's add a comment up here. Let me do this kind of thing where I'll add a comment and I'll just say main nav bar. Okay, and then I come back here and I reload the page. And I do document.body.innerHTML, what we'll see is that that comment actually does show up inside of here. These weird looking kind of characters here, which are not the angle brackets, are because I didn't actually use the correct HTML escape codes. So these are actually being like character escaped here by innerHTML. These are the hex codes technically, I think, behind the scenes, because technically when we do this, what we should be doing is like the this is, I think, the less than and the greater than sign, right? So if you think about it, these different signs mean something in HTML. So when we're trying to grab them, in the case of a text node, I believe it actually changes it to be its hex code. So not really interesting for us. We can kind of ignore that. The main thing to notice is that it's actually grabbing the text nodes, it's grabbing the actual comment nodes, and it's also grabbing all the actual tags, the HTML elements themselves, and all the new lines in there. Okay. So that is us reading from innerHTML. All right. Now, what we can do is we can actually write to it. So check this out. I'm going to do document.body.innerHTML, and I'm going to do equals to. I'm going to assign back into it, which is what I mean when I say I'm writing to this property. When we're reading from it, we're just pulling out that variable. In this case, we're putting content back into the variable. It already is equal to that string. I'm going to ask it to be equal to another string. All right. So I'm just going to say I'm going to make this equal the string hello. All right. And I want you to watch really carefully as I do this. Watch on the left side of my screen, the actual nav bar, the elements change when I press the enter key to reassign this inner HTML. You ready? 1, 2, and 3. All right, so check that out, right? We have hello now, and it totally clobbered out that unordered list of my different list items. Now, if I go back to my elements tab, what we'll see is that the body literally has nothing in it except this text node. Right? So that's kind of interesting, right? So the head we didn't change because I was only doing something to document.body, but I could actually do the same thing to head, right? I just did document.body in this case. So that's kind of weird, right? So we totally clobbered everything in there and replaced it with our string, in this case, which got converted to a text node. Now, if I look at document.body.innerHTML now, you'll notice that it's just the string hello. And if I do document.body.firstChild, you'll see that it is the text node hello, right? And in this case, first elements child is going to be the same thing, it's going to be null, I should say, because there's actually no element. We only have a text node as our first child. Okay, there is no actual HTML elements inside the body. So if I do, let me clear this out. If I do document.body.child nodes, what we'll see is a node list of size 1. If I do document.body.children, we'll see there's an HTML collection because children is only HTML elements. And this is just a string, which is a text node in this case, right there. Okay. So that's kind of interesting. What else can we do with this? So I'm going to do document.body.innerHTML, and I'm going to make it equal to, let's just say, I'm going to make it equal to a string, and I'm actually going to put in some HTML here. So I'm going to say it's going to equal to an h1 tag, and I'm just going to put hello in the h1 tag with an exclamation, and I'm going to close this h1 tag. Okay, it kind of wrapped on my screen. I didn't actually press a new line because it just kind of went off the screen there, so it's all on one line. Okay, now watch carefully. I'm going to press enter again, and let's see if we notice any differences. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, so check that out, right? Now we have changed this to be an actual h1 tag. So if we switch back to our elements, now my body, I can open this and notice that there's an actual h1 tag in here, right? It's no longer just a text node, it's an actual h1 element node. So if I come back to my console, and I do document.body.firstChild, it's going to be the h1 node, and I do document.body.firstElementChild, which previously was not null because it was a text node. Now we actually get back our h1 tag, which is a valid HTML heading element. Okay, so that's pretty darn awesome. It turns out we can actually basically create an entire HTML page in a string and shove it in innerHTML, and it will just show up on our page. Okay. Now, this is kind of the first issue. The first issue is kind of exactly what you just saw. When we change innerHTML, what we're really doing is erasing everything in there already. So the first step is to take everything out, and we're replacing it with whatever we're putting on the right-hand side of the equal sign. So we're basically clobbering out everything in there and replacing it with new nodes. Okay, this can be kind of have unforeseen consequences, can cause bugs, and maybe we accidentally get rid of an entire tree by accident, and then a bunch of stuff breaks on our page. It's just generally not a good thing to do because you can accidentally kind of clobber an entire element tree if you're not careful. Now, there are other issues as well. We haven't got to this topic yet. We're going to get to it in future videos, but there's this idea of event listeners. For example, if you think that, we have a button on our page, right? If that had an event listener on it, like a click event, that would actually disappear. Or if we had a mouse over or mouse enter event, all these different things that we can notice once we add them to different elements on the page, for example, a div tag or a p tag, all of those will disappear and they get removed. So we generally don't want that to happen. Most of the time we want to really control when we're removing these listeners, and it can kind of cause, again, kind of unforeseen bugs if we expect something to happen when we like hover our mouse over something and now it's kind of just randomly disappeared. Okay. So just be really careful with innerHTML in that sense as well. Now, this one is less of an issue, but more of an issue with really, really big applications. If you can imagine you have a tree that's really, really large, like let's say hundreds of lines of HTML, and you try to use something like innerHTML, it might get a bit slow, right? So the browser has to parse it, try to figure out how it's all displayed, what all the elements are. It's going to create all those elements, and then it's going to take out the current stuff and replace all of that stuff in there, style everything in there properly. It has to do all of that, right? So if we have a lot of lines of HTML that we're replacing, it can actually get quite slow, especially if there's a lot of other stuff going on the page. So just be aware of that. All right. So that is innerHTML. There's a lot more stuff we can do with this, but I really want to kind of save some of the cooler stuff for some of the exercises, as well as when we actually get to creating our own elements, because I don't want us to rely on innerHTML because of a lot of the issues that I've just mentioned, plus a few more at the end of the video. So the next thing that we need to look at is text content. This is basically a safer, quote unquote, version of innerHTML. Now let's take a look at the same example here that I have on the left-hand side of the screen. If we have a body tag, and that body has the same nav bar with the same UL, with the same LIs inside of it, the 3 list items for our nav bar. If instead of innerHTML, we did document.body.textContent, we would actually get this. Right? So notice there's a small difference between this, right? This is the innerHTML, right? And this is text content. innerHTML, text content. innerHTML, text content, right? So what is happening here? So you probably noticed that this is effectively all of the text without the actual text. Hence text content. Now, this is kind of interesting because we're actually asking for the text content of the body. The body is this whole thing, right? But what looks like is happening, it's effectively going into all the children nodes as well, right? So we're actually getting all of the text in all of the children in this tree clumped up together. Okay, so let's take a look at how this works. So recall that this is our current example, right? We have a comment in here. We have a bunch of LIs with our home, blog, and videos. And then we have kind of our nav bar and UL wrapping those. Okay, so I know this is innerHTML.html. I could probably change the title here for text content, but you can probably bear with me while I just use the same document for now. So I'm just going to reload this page just so I get back my home, blog, and videos, just so that we can confirm that if we go to the elements tag, we have our nav, here's our comment, here's our UL with all of our different LIs in there, right? So that's all working as expected. Now, if I go back to my console and I do document.body.textContent, what we're going to see is a whole bunch of new lines, which is what's inserted by Prettier for us to actually make the spacing work. Notice that there is no comment here. Okay, that's also another difference. There is no comment in this case. We have our home, we have our blog, and we have our videos, and all a bunch of new lines after that. So what this really is purely all of the text inside the DOM minus the comments and minus all the tags. Okay. Now this might seem kind of weird. It's like, okay, well, why would we ever use this? Like, isn't the innerHTML one more useful? Well, this is safer because if we insert something that's HTML, it just gets converted to text because we can also write to text content just like we wrote to innerHTML. Right now, we're just reading from it. We can't accidentally insert HTML onto the page that's like malformed or has a bunch of issues, or it might even be dangerous in some cases. So let me show you kind of one example of this. If I do document.body.textContent and I set it equal to hello, and I do that, so notice that it goes right back to exactly what we had before with the innerHTML. Okay, and if I go to the Elements tab, you'll see that we have body, we have hello, which is a text node in this case, which is the only node inside our HTML document. This is not an HTML node, this is just a text node, right? Document.body.firstChild is a text node, you can see there, and I press enter and it evaluates to the hello. All right, now if I do document.body.textContent, but I try to assign it some HTML. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put this in h1 tag. I'm going to say hello, and I'm going to close the h1 tag. Again, it's going to wrap to a new line. And with innerHTML, what we saw is that this actually gets parsed as HTML and gets inserted as an h1 tag. Let's take a look at what happens with text content. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so not what you expected, right? Definitely kind of weird, right? We actually got literally the string that we inserted. If we go back to our elements tab, we see that it's literally the string with h1 in it, right? So if I do documents.body.firstChild, we're going to grab literally the string with the h1 kind of part of the string, right? They weren't actually parsed as HTML. This is just a text node. So if I do document.body.first element child, there's no element in here. This is just a text node. Okay. So this is why partially it's a lot safer to use text content, because we can't accidentally put a bunch of random HTML into our nodes. There are cases where this might actually cause a security risk if we start injecting HTML into our nodes and we're not very careful. Okay, so text content, the main difference is it's safer, but also it's faster because it doesn't need to be parsed as HTML. It's just purely a string and it just gets shoved in there, right? So it's very, very useful for things like paragraph tags and h1 tags and all that kind of stuff, right? We can easily just kind of put text inside of them, which is the whole purpose of those tags. Generally, you want to use text content when you're doing text, putting it into those nodes, because that's literally the purpose of those nodes. Okay, so let's take a look at innerHTML again, just to kind of see and bring this all together. So I would advise you not to use innerHTML at all, pretty much all the time or ever, right? Now, there are cases where it's useful and you can be kind of assured for the most part that it's okay. But generally speaking, there is almost always a good alternative to innerHTML, and you should just use text content to keep it safe if you want to put text into the DOM. If you actually want to put HTML into the DOM, we're going to see how we can actually create our own HTML elements ourselves in a safer way so that random HTML doesn't get injected into the DOM if, for example, our server got hacked or something like that. Okay, so I want to kind of go over that a little bit more because it might seem a bit confusing as to why we shouldn't be using this. So as I mentioned, don't use this, right? Whenever possible. Now, there's edge cases, but whenever possible, don't use this. When you're on a team and you're working kind of as part of a very large group or organization, and everyone's contributing to the code for an app or a project, generally speaking, if you use innerHTML, the code is going to get flagged. Okay, it's very rare that an organization will allow innerHTML style of code to be pushed to their repository and then deployed to production. Okay, because there's a lot of security issues that get opened up if you actually have things using innerHTML inside of the code and you're not careful with how you use it. Now, again, there's always exceptions to this, but generally speaking, you really want to get in the habit of not using it, and we're going to look at some of those methods in future videos. But there are other better ways to do this. That doesn't mean that we can't add HTML to our DOM. We can. We can actually add all sorts of HTML to DOM. We can create an entire DOM, just like you can imagine if you created an entire innerHTML with a string. We can do the same thing using different DOM methods that are much safer and actually, frankly, quite more robust and easier to understand. There are much better ways than just adding a big string to make an entire web page. So try to avoid using innerHTML. In the exercises, I might actually show kind of a way that this might cause some issues because, like, generally it's the types of attacks that kind of come up as a result of innerHTML usually are a bit more kind of insidious. Like, for example, imagine that we're talking to a server. We're going to get into this in future videos as well, and we think that we trust that server or we own that server, and we have some innerHTML that's being sent back to the website, if someone gets control of that server that's not us, they can actually send back innerHTML and kind of run code that is not our code that would actually maybe reach out to some other server that's malicious, right? So there's many other cases where, you know, the trust is kind of just assumed. And generally when you're working with web development, you want to kind of trust pretty much nothing, right? You want to be very careful when it comes to security. And this is definitely way beyond the scope of just this video. And I'd love to create kind of a whole series on different web security topics and security in general when it comes to computing. But suffice to say that really just innerHTML, use it when you're first learning, appreciate what it does, but realize that behind the scenes, there are a lot of kind of small issues that might come up as a result of using it. And if you really think about it, the browser is actually taking that HTML and parsing it anyways. So we can actually tap into those kind of parsing methods and element creation methods ourselves instead of kind of doing it the quote unquote lazier way or more dangerous way using innerHTML. So I hope you found this video instructive and interesting. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. As I mentioned, in the next video, we're going to go over a bunch of exercises together to get more practice with this concept so that we just have a good understanding of how to manipulate the DOM in general, both with innerHTML and text content. And we might even see an example where it's a little bit tricky and dangerous in some cases. And that's going to set us up really well for the next videos where we're actually going to start looking at different attributes and also custom attributes that are part of the different HTML element tags. I can't wait to get to that video. I'll see you there. See you later.